Aiden with me, and we're going to answer any questions that you might have while we talk. Jaden, you want to introduce yourself? Just tell everybody a little bit about who you are.
Okay.
People at Brentwood know you.
Yeah.
Some other places people know you. So you're my son.
Yep, I'm his son.
What number are you?
I'm the fourth kid.
Yep. How many boys? What's your order in the boys?
I'm the third boy. So I'm the second youngest.
Yep. With the curliest hair amongst the boys. That's right. Okay, so that is Jaden. What else? I was going to ask you if you had any questions to get started. You might have some come up as we go along.
None that I can think of right now.
Okay, great. So what we'll do is we'll start with a question that I had, and it was about Bible translations, Bible versions. Like somebody wanted to know which version of the Bible should they use. Right, that's a good question. If you have a question about the Bible, the translation, right? Like the New International Version, the King James Version, the New King James. People wanted to know what version should they be using. The Hunts are with us. It's good to see y'all. So we're talking about Bible versions, whether or not which we should be using, and maybe why there are so many. So I've heard people say before, oh, well, there's so many different translations of the Bible that you really can't. You can't trust it because there's so many different ones and there's so many differences. Well, what you're dealing with, the reason why there are so many different translations is not because there are so many different texts necessarily, but because people take the Greek text that we have, and we have compiled different pieces of evidence that we have throughout history into what we now think of as the Greek text of the New Testament, and they translate that into English. And when you think about the translation process, anytime you translate something from one language to another, you can do it different ways, right? Like your mom and I might sit down and translate something from Spanish into English. And the very first difference, if we were to do that, is that your mom's translation would be right and mine would be almost entirely made up, right? But I mean, we could both do it, right? And there would be differences. There are idiomatic expressions. Do you know what that is? An idiom, do you know what an idiom is? Like we might say they were like a cat on a hot tin roof. Have you ever heard that? No? Let me see. Now I mentioned idiomatic expressions. I can't think of them. So if you can think of an idiomatic expression, feel free to put them in the comments. They're expressions that we say that aren't literal, right? Like, I'm going to eat you for lunch.
Or like, it's hot enough to fry an egg.
Yeah, although sometimes that could be literal. Yeah. That's true. But have you ever seen, like, if you think about what it would be like to be a cat on a hot tin roof, they're not going to be really happy, right? They're going to really, So that's kind of the idea of an idiomatic expression, is it's something that you say that conveys an idea that isn't the same thing as what the words actually mean. Like if somebody says, I'm going to eat you for lunch, it means they're really angry at you and they're going to, they want to beat you up. But they're not going to sit down and like put you on a plate and bite your toes, right? That's not what's going to happen. So the Bible is full of idiomatic expressions. And sometimes they get translated differently depending on where you are, what kind of English you speak, or even a foreign language, right? Bible translations in England are slightly different than maybe one that you're going to make for an American, because we speak different versions of the same language. And so there's just differences in language itself. There are also different ideas behind translation. Like one idea when it comes to the Bible is that people want the words to be translated literally, right? They want an equivalent version, an equivalent rendering of the Greek into English. That sounds like a really good idea, but it's hard to do because, it's raining cats and dogs is another idiomatic expression, right? But it's not really raining cats and dogs. It's just raining very badly, right? Thank you for that. And so when we think about moving, precisely from one language into another, it doesn't work because different languages have different logical structures. English and Spanish is another good example. You can always tell an English professor, okay, students, your Spanish teachers and your Spanish professor, if you go to like Google Translate and you type an English sentence into Google Translate and you translate it into Spanish, your Spanish instructor will know if you have done that, because you don't structure Spanish sentences the same way that you might structure an English sentence. Right? There are different ways that they say things because the logical structure of the language is different. Go ahead.
I think it's the same thing with Latin. I think like how the sentences are spoken are different.
Yes, and the same thing is true with Greek. The structure of a sentence is different because the logic of the language works differently than the logic of English. In Greek, you can have the subject and the predicate nominative, they can be in different places. But in English, you typically put your subject first and anything in the predicate is going to go after, typically, right? And so just the structures of languages are different. So you can't always do a literal translation, in a strictly literal translation from one language to another, because sometimes you wind up with something that would be gibberish in the language that you're translating to, right? Or it would sound weird. You would, like if you've ever ordered something, this is a good example. If you've ever ordered something from China and they didn't hire the company who maybe like wrote the instruction manual, if they didn't hire somebody who spoke English to write the instruction manual, if they just took the Chinese language and threw it into a translator and then wrote down whatever, came out of the translator, like, I think it was something like this, like your mom and I got noodles one time and we were laughing because it said something like, boil the noodles to happiness and enjoy with clouds. It was something silly like that, right? Because they took the Chinese language, which totally made sense to a Chinese person, a Chinese speaker. And when they put that into the translator and it spit out English, well, the person who put it in the translator didn't know English, right? That's why they used the translator.
So they would just write down whatever they saw.
And then they just copied it over, and it was a sentence that didn't make any sense in English, right? And so you can tell whoever did that didn't speak English. Well, if you did that with the Greek text and you just put it straight over into English, you would think to yourself when you read it, whoever did that, they didn't know how to speak English because it would be goofy, right? It would be weird. And so what you have is men and women who have spent their lives studying Greek and English. Right? They become experts in both languages, and when they move the thoughts from one language over into the other. They move the thought from Greek over into English. And so even with a translation that claims to be more literal, really what you're doing is you're taking the thoughts and sometimes the exact words, right? But you're going to have to restructure things. You're taking the thought and you're moving it over into English. Okay, so you have to know both languages in order to do that well. Well, when you start doing that, then you wind up with different versions. Like the New International Version is a good Bible translation. Their thought was that they're going to give you more of the general idea. They're going to try and say things in words that a modern English speaker would use. And so when you read the NIV, it's going to be very close to other Bible translations, but there'll be some differences. For example, one of the Greek words that often shows up in the New Testament is brothers, right? But the word brothers in Greek, it often could refer to brothers and sisters, a mixed group of people. And so sometimes, like in the NIV, it will actually say brothers and sisters. I haven't seen it yet, but it would be a good translation. You might theoretically put the word siblings in, because sibling is a genderless word in English, right? It could be a group of men, it could be a group of women, it could be a group of men and women. And so with that sort of genderless or mixed gender Greek word, you could just put the word siblings in, right? And so there's all these different ways that you can move from one translation to another. It doesn't mean that this translation is wrong because it doesn't have the exact same words as the one that you have, right? So this is actually the New American Standard that I have in front of me. And this, Jaden has the English Standard Version. If you read them, there's going to be differences. So let's turn over to a passage. Turn over to Colossians chapter 3. And so what you have with these two different translations is you have two different translation committees they got together. They had a large group of people for both of them, and they translated it from Greek into English. And then they talked about what they thought was the idea the writer is trying to make and how you can best express that idea in English. And then they tried to express it, right? So Colossians chapter 3. So go ahead and read the first couple of verses.
Okay. If then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God.
Okay, stop right there. So your first word is if. My first word is therefore. Mine says therefore if. And yours says if then. Right? Therefore if you have been raised up. Mine says raised up, and yours just says raised. Right? So there's little variations like that. Well, the fact that this is raised up and yours says raised, does that change the meaning of the text?
No.
No. It just gives you a better picture, right? One is raising. The word raise means to lift up, right? So up is actually an extra word. You don't really need it in English. But this one says raised up. And then what does yours say after that?
With Christ.
Yours just says, seek the things that are above. And mine says, keep seeking the things that are above. And what you have is the New American Standard Bible takes that verb there for seek, and it is an active verb. It means it's an ongoing action. And so yours says, seek what is above. And this one, just to be maybe a little bit more technically correct, says, keep seeking the things above. Right? So that's why there's subtle differences. It's not that the New American Standard is better and the English Standard Version is worse, per se. It's just different thoughts about how to best translate from one language over to another. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's why you have a lot of different English translations, because there's different thoughts, different ideas about what would be the best way to translate something. And so sometimes there are passages where they're going to be almost identical. Right? The two different versions will be almost identical. There'll be some passages where maybe there's a little bit of variation. There are some translations that are called paraphrase translations. Paraphrase translations are great, especially they're great in a particular case. They are great if you're just trying to get a feel for what a book is teaching. Right? So if you're reading something for the very first time and maybe it's very unfamiliar to you and you're not exactly sure what is being talked about, a paraphrase translation is a great tool to use. One is the Contemporary English Version, the CEV. It is a paraphrase translation. You would not want to take the Contemporary English Version and try to do word studies. Okay, that's not what that Bible is made for. The Contemporary English Version is made so that you can take a book of the Bible that maybe is difficult for you to understand, and you can read it, and they try and make it much more understandable. So what you have to realize when you read that one is that you're not getting a very close to the original translation. They're trying to give you the general meaning, right? And that can be really helpful. If you're reading something that just makes zero sense, you might want to try a paraphrase translation. But you have to do that understanding that what you're reading is a paraphrase, right? It's like the Cliff Notes version is maybe a good way to think of it. You don't know what Cliff Notes are.
No,
So Cliff Notes are like if you were assigned a book to read and you read the book, the Cliff Notes is like a reader's guide, right? It would help you. Like, especially, people will often get it with Shakespeare because the language can be a little bit clunky and difficult for a modern English speaker. It shouldn't be, but sometimes it is. And they'll get the Cliff Notes, and the Cliff Notes will help kind of walk you through it and say, well, this is what this section means. This is what this section means. And it explains it in modern language so that you can understand it better. So a paraphrase Bible does the same thing, but with the Bible. It takes a piece of the Bible and says, okay, this is generally what the author meant when he said these things. And so it's easier for us to read because it's written more the way that we talk and the way that we think. And it just gives you the basic idea instead of getting caught up in all of the details that are in a text. So you wouldn't use that, again, for in-depth Bible study. Right? So you have all these different tools, but we need to make sure that we're using the appropriate tool for the appropriate thing. So you wouldn't use a paraphrase Bible for an in-depth Bible study, but you would use it if you were lost. I have no idea what this book is about. I need some help. right? So then you would use a paraphrase Bible. And once you kind of got a feel for what the book was about, then you could move over to a more literal translation, like the NIV or the English Standard Version, the New American Standard are all really good. And then you could start working through those. Now, the most popular Bible to date is the King James Bible. It is the first widely published Bible in English. There were a couple Bibles beforehand that were published in English. The Darby Bible, or the Tyndale Bible, the Wycliffe Bible, or the Geneva Bible, I think is before the King James. I might have those a little bit out of order. I'd have to go look it up. I don't have the timeline memorized. But there are a couple English Bibles before the King James. But the King James is the first widely distributed and widely published English Bible because the King of England sanctioned it, right? And technically, there's a royal copyright. People will say, oh, the King James isn't copyrighted. It is in England because it has a royal copyright. I don't think a royal copyright ever expires. So it is the most widely published and widely loved English translation. There's nothing wrong with the King James as long as you understand that what you're holding in your hand today, if you go to the store and you buy a King James Bible today, it's not the same Bible that was originally published in 1611. Right? They have changed it and modified it throughout the years. And so there are various updates throughout the history of the King James Bible. And so you might run across somebody every once in a while who says, oh, we can only use the King James Bible because when the King James Bible was translated, it was divinely translated. There's no evidence for that. And if it was divinely translated, why do we change it? Right? The Bible that you would buy if you went and bought a King James Bible is not the translation that was made in 1611. We've updated the spelling. We've changed some of the sentence structure. We've changed some of the words. And so it's not the same. It's very similar, but it's not exactly the same. Another thing you have to be aware of is that when the translators of the King James Bible translated it, I think they only had, the exact number escapes me, but I think it was like 10 manuscripts, right? So they were working off of 10 different original Greek language documents. We have thousands now. And so it's not that modern scholars are smarter than the people who translated the King James Bible. It's that the scholars who were translating the King James Bible into English only had 10 sources. So if you're translating something and you only have 10 sources and somebody else comes along later and translates something and they have 5,000 sources, who do you think is going to be able to give you a more accurate translation?
The 5,000 sources.
Yes. And so it's not that they did a bad job. They did a phenomenal job. It's that we know more now, right? We have more information now.
So they would have to speak ancient Greek to translate it.
Yeah, or read it.
I thought it was lost. Okay.
No, we know how to read it. And we're unsure of how it's pronounced. It might be very similar to modern Greek, right? Modern Greek and Koine Greek, the language that it's written in, and even the more formal Attic Greek, right? Classical Greek. They're very similar languages. There are just slight differences. You could probably take a Greek copy of the New Testament to somebody in Greece today, and they could probably read it, right? But there might be, like, again, differences of expression and things might change a little bit. But Greek has been an enduring language. It's a language that has been around for a very long time. People have been studying it and learning it for a long time. It also helps that the Greek Orthodox Church became very powerful, right? So the church itself preserved the Greek language. What we don't know a lot about are some of the other ancient languages that are in the Bible. Like, we can read them, but we may not know how to pronounce them, right? We don't know exactly what ancient Hebrew sounded like. We don't know what Chaldean sounded like. We don't know what Aramaic sounded like. We can make really good guesses, right? But we have lost some of the pronunciation. We've also, there are languages that are no longer used, like ancient Hebrew is no longer spoken. Latin is no longer spoken. Like, there's not a country and they use Latin, right? But the Latin is a translation. Anyway, so one of the things to remember is the King James Bible, they only had 10 sources. And so there were some problems with the sources that they had. They weren't the most accurate sources. And so there are some parts of the King James Bible where it actually adds verses in. What happens over time is as monks are copying the text of the Bible and they're copying things in, sometimes they'll make an explanatory note. Like something will happen and they'll make it some marginal note. They'll make a little note over in the margin. Like people will write in their Bibles. They'll make a little marginal note over there. Well, what if you had to copy your entire Bible by hand? What if it was all handwritten and then you put a little note over in the margin one time? And then somebody else years later came and took the copy of your Bible that was handwritten and they made a copy based on your copy. And they saw the note that you put in the margin, and now they don't know, is that just a note that Jaden made? Or is that part of the text that maybe he accidentally left out and he put it over there just to make sure that it gets included? Well, I better put it in to be safe.
So extra stuff gets put in.
So extra stuff gets put in over time. And it's often explanations of things. So there are a couple places in the New Testament where the King James Bible actually has stuff added in. One of the most famous places is over in 1 John chapter 5. So turn over in your Bible to 1 John chapter 5. All right. So the New American Standard says, there are three that testify. The Spirit, the water, and the blood, and the three are in agreement. That's pretty much what yours says, right? Read that 1 John chapter 5, verse 7 and 8.
For there are three that testify, the Spirit and the water and the blood, and these three agree.
Yes. See, even our translations are a little bit different, but they say the same thing. So the King James Version says, there are three that testify in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one. And they are the three that testify on the earth. Right? That's the marginal note that says there are manuscripts that add this. The King James Version has that. It's not supposed to be there. And so if you're reading through the King James Bible, and you know that verse 8 is not correct, right? Does it change anything?
No.
No. It's extra information, right, that wasn't originally in the letter. But are the Father, the Spirit, and the Son, or the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, are they in heaven?
Yes.
Do they agree?
Yes.
Do they all testify that what the Bible says is true?
Yes.
Okay, so it's right. But it just wasn't in the original text. And so what happened probably is some scribe came along and was copying what John said. There are three that testify. And they probably wrote over on the side, hey, this is a lot like the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. There are three and they're in heaven and they testify. And they probably drew that connection. And over time, that connection gets added into the text and it becomes part of a manuscript. And so we just have to know that that's not supposed to be there. And so the King James Bible is a good Bible. They did a great job translating it. You just have to understand that there are certain things that get added into the Bible that weren't originally there. And if you know what they are and you're careful, then that's okay. Right? Just like if you know that the contemporary English version is a paraphrase, and so you're not going to use it to try and do deep study in the original language. I mean, you can't. But if you're just using it to kind of get a feel for what something is about, well, it's a good Bible for that. Okay, and if you want a Bible, if you're looking for a Bible that you really don't have to think, be worried about too much, is this a paraphrase? Is this originally what was there? If you don't want to have to ask those kinds of questions, then there are two Bibles that I generally recommend that people get. It's the English Standard Version.
That's what I have.
The English Standard Version or the NIV. Some people really like the New American Standard Bible, and it's a great Bible. I mean, I have one. I really like it. It's just not one of my top two, right? It would be my number 3. And that's just totally personal preference. Some people would give you a different list of your top 3. But my top 3 are the English Standard Version, the NIV, and then the New American Standard Bible in that order. And the reason why it's in that order is because the English Standard Version is very literal. They're consistent with their words. So if a Greek word shows up in different places, they tend to use the same English word. The reason why the NIV is second is because the NIV does a better job of keeping ideas, right? Of giving you the idea. And so if you have the English Standard Version and you have the NIV and you read both of them, if you're looking at the same passage and you read both, you get a really good feel for what the passage is trying to teach you. The reason why the New American Standard Bible is number 3 is because it's a really wooden translation. It's difficult to read in English, right? Like we, raised up from Colossians 3. Well, raise goes up. I don't need that extra word, but they put it in there. And it's okay that they do. They are strictly literal, right? They try to go as close to Greek as possible. And if that's really what you want, then the New American Standard Bible is probably the one that you should get, right? But the English Standard Version does a good job balancing strictly literal versus what's the idea. And the NIV tends toward more what's the idea. So it just depends on what you're looking for in the Bible that you choose. Does that make sense? All right. I know that wasn't your question, but did that bring up any questions that you might have, just kind of talking about the Bible in general? Or did you think of anything?
Not really.
No? Okay. Well, we don't have any questions. We haven't gotten any questions. And we may just leave that there then for tonight. Talking about the different Bible translations is a good discussion. You're not going to go wrong if you go to a bookstore and you get the English Standard Version, the New American Standard Version, the NIV. Those 3 Bibles will never steer you wrong. The King James Bible is okay. The New King James Bible is probably better than the King James because it takes away some of the language difficulties. For example, can you tell me what a kine is? K-I-N-E? What is that?
I don't know.
Okay, what if I told you that 7 kine came out of a river and ate corn?
I would say they're cows.
They're cows, yep. And there's no corn in Egypt.
Yeah.
So why does the King James Version say that there's corn in Egypt?
Because that's what they had?
Nope, there's no corn.
I mean, like, that's what they had when they wrote.
You're close, yes. So there's 2 problems that a modern English reader has with the Joseph's dream in the King James Version. Kine come up out of the river and eat corn. All right? A kine is cattle. And if you don't know that, that doesn't make sense. What are these 7 things? Actually, I got the story wrong, right? There's 7 healthy kine that eat 7 skinny kine.
This skinny kine.
Right, and then you have corn eating corn, right?
Yeah.
If you don't know what a kine is, then that doesn't make any sense. And if you know that corn was not in ancient Egypt, then that doesn't make any sense. Well, kine is cattle, so you've got cattle coming up and eating each other. And then corn is a generic word. Like, what do you think of when you hear the word corn?
I think of corn on the cob.
Yeah, golden, delicious grain that's sweet and juicy and makes good popcorn, right? Actually, sweet corn doesn't really make good popcorn. Yeah. But anyway, it's good, right? Corn is the primary grain of a region. That is what that word means. It is the primary grain from any region. So in the United States, corn might actually be maize. The yellow stuff that you eat is maize. It's not corn. It's maize, right? In the Ukraine, what do you think the corn is in Ukraine? Wheat. Yeah, they grow a lot.
I don't know about.
I know it's a really random question, right? They grow a lot of wheat in the Ukraine. What is the corn in Ireland?
I don't know anything.
Barley, maybe, or rye. I don't know what they grow the most of there, but it changes. So you just use a generic word corn, and it means the primary grain in any region. And so when the 7 healthy stalks of corn eat the 7 unhealthy stalks, or it's the other way around, the 7 unhealthy eat the 7 healthy, it doesn't mean the golden, delicious, long corn on the cobs are eating each other. What it means is the primary grain of Egypt, right? And so the New King James fixes that. The New King James updates the language so that a modern English reader can read it. Yeah.
So what do you think the the corn was for Egypt?
It was probably something like wheat. There were different ancient grains that grew in that region at that time. It would probably be most recognizable to us as wheat. It could also have been rye or barley. Yeah, probably wheat. What do you think? I think it was corn. Okay, you got any other questions? Any other things you want to talk about? It doesn't necessarily have to be a question.
Not really.
Okay.
Are there any visions that omit scripture that is doctrine they disagree with?
Oh, that's a good question. Are there any versions that omit scripture that is doctrine that they disagree with? The answer to that question is yes, there are. But you probably are not going to see them at a bookstore. Some people will say that like the contemporary English version does that because it's a paraphrase. So you just have to know that with certain Bibles, the Good News Bible is also a paraphrase. If you get a paraphrase, it's going to skip stuff. It's going to leave it out. It combines verses sometimes. And so if you are really trying to get like a word for word translation, do not get a paraphrase Bible at all. But if, again, you just want to read the story, if you're brand new to the Bible and you don't know anything about the story, if you don't know anything about the books, then reading through a paraphrase Bible is not a bad idea. You just have to understand that you really shouldn't use that Bible to try and talk about doctrine, which is a word that the Hunts used. So doctrine is teaching. What is the teaching in Christianity about a certain topic? Well, if a paraphrase Bible is skipping things and putting some things together, and if it's just giving you the general idea, then that's not a really good Bible for trying to figure out what doctrine would be, right? We want a more literal translation, like the New American Standard Bible, the English Standard Version, the NIV, the King James, the New King James. Those are the kinds of Bibles that you want if you're going to be dealing with doctrine. There are Bibles that do leave those things out. Typically, there are Bibles that are used by religious groups. For example, and I'm not trying to be overly negative or judgmental, but there are religious groups that alter the scriptures, and I'm not talking about the members of those religious groups, but the leaders of those groups have altered the scriptures to match their peculiar views. So if you happen to be watching or ever run across this video and you are a Jehovah's Witness, I'm not saying that you have done these things, but years ago, when the Watchtower organization put together the New World Translation, they changed things. I'll give you a super good example of that. If you look over in John chapter 1, the Gospel of John chapter 1, here's the New American Standard Bible, which is great. The New American Standard Bible, I know it's I said it was my third favorite, but if you want like word for word, that's probably the best English Bible that does that. It's a little wooden and hard to read, but that's because they're so strictly literal. My favorite Bible is the ESV. Oh, I forgot to mention one, the Christian Standard Bible. That might, I think, I would recommend that before the NIV. So I guess the NIV becomes number 4. It says, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Okay, so the New World Translation, the Jehovah's Witness Bible, comes and takes verse 1, and it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was a God. That's a big change. And what they do is they're not necessarily leaving something out, but they're changing what the text says by inserting what we call an indefinite article. So English has 2 articles. It has a definite and indefinite. And the is a definite article. Like if I talk about the chair, it's one chair in particular. If I talk about a chair, it could be any chair, right? The teacher versus a teacher in English. The teacher is one in particular teacher. A teacher could be anyone who is a teacher. Okay? Greek has a definite article, but it has no indefinite article. So if there is an article in the sentence, it is the word the, right? And sometimes that matters, and sometimes it doesn't. Here in John chapter 1, there is a definite article before the word, but there is no article before God. And so what the Watchtower does is they come and they just throw the article in, an indefinite article, and they say, oh, well, we can do that because where there isn't an article on the text, we can put an indefinite article in. The problem is Greek doesn't work exactly like that. Greek uses declensions. Right? So a language that has declensions is where the nouns change, right? And this is very complicated grammar rules. If you're not familiar with declensions, Latin has declensions, Greek has declensions. It's where different ways that you use the noun, the ending of the noun changes. It's a declined, right? Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just agreeing.
So you're learning that, right, with Latin. Yeah. So the nouns change. Well, what happens is in this sentence, the Word was God. That is our sentence. We have a linking verb, was. It's the past tense of to be. The Word was God. It's defining what the word is. And the way that Greek works, with that linking verb, there is no article because the predicate nominative, which is God there, takes on the same declension as the subject. And if the subject is definite, then the predicate nominative is also definite. And you don't have to put the definite article again, because when you have a linking verb and the sentence is structured like this, you leave the article out. So what you have is the word, definite article, linking verb was, and now you have God declined, which matches the word. And so there is no way to properly translate it as the word was a God. It just absolutely makes no sense. And so the text actually says the word was God. But that translation comes along and alters it, right? But you're probably not going to find a New World Translation at a bookstore if you go there and look for it. You can, however, find it online for free if you want to make that comparison. And if you go visit a Kingdom Hall, or you happen to know somebody who's a Jehovah's Witness, they will probably give you a copy for free. But you have to realize that that translation of the Bible, they have never released the names of the people who translated it, whereas the NIV will tell you all the names of everybody who translated it. The New American Standard Bible will tell you the names of everybody who translated it, so that if you wanted to, you could go check their credentials and make sure that they were actually qualified to translate over into English, right? But the New World Translation doesn't do that. They keep the names of their translators hidden and secret. And so that makes me really nervous, especially when you start looking at the text and they've made all sorts of changes to the text. That's not good, right? There's something wrong there. So yes, there are translations that are dangerous because they change doctrine. And what you've just done, if you say that Jesus is a God, you have radically changed the doctrine of the Trinity. You have radically changed the Bible's teaching that there is one true living God. And you have made a mess of all sorts of things. And we can't do that. Right? We can't do that. Can deaf change hearing? I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that question. Can deaf change hearing? If you get a chance to clarify that, I would love to help answer it. Can deaf change hearing? Maybe are there translations for people who can't hear? The answer is yes. There are Braille copies of the Bible that you can get if you happen to speak Braille. If you can read Braille. There are also other devices that they use for people who have a hard time hearing. I don't know the name of it, but they have Bibles on those devices also. So if for some reason you have difficulty hearing, you can use either Braille. Oh, that would be sight.
Yeah.
Braille.
It's like, I don't know why you would have to use Braille if you couldn't hear.
Yeah, I was totally answering that wrong. Yeah, Vision, they have Braille copies. I guess if you can't hear it, okay. So yeah, what I would do then is I would just get a good English translation. If you happen to speak English, if not, whatever language you happen to be. Okay, well, that's good to know. He said that he reads our lips.
That's cool.
That is cool. I could not do that. We will try maybe and find some way to get captions, if that would be helpful. I don't know how to do that, but we'll try and figure it out. Yeah, so my advice for somebody who had a hard time hearing or who struggled with that or who is deaf would be just to get a really good English translation and let the leaders in your local church know that you struggle with hearing or that you are deaf, and hopefully they can get somebody to sign so that you're not having to read everybody's lips all the time. Because if they look away or they turn away, which sometimes I get in the habit of doing, you'll miss what's being said, and it's important. Actually, we visited a church not all that long ago where they had somebody who translated everything. Yeah, they did everything in sign language.
That's pretty cool.
It was cool. Even the songs, which I had never seen people sing in sign language before.
Yeah.
But that was the first time. That was really neat. All right. So are there any other? There's not any other questions, and we'll go ahead and we'll stop there. And we'll look into finding a way to caption things. That might be hard to do live, but at the very least, we could probably caption them afterwards. There might be some way to do captions for live video. We'll have to look into it. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. It's always a blessing. We do this every Friday night at 7 o'clock. If you get a chance to join us, that I would love it for you to join us. You can send your questions in on whatever platform you happen to be watching. You can just submit your questions through Twitter, through Facebook, YouTube, however you happen to connect. And that's how we get questions for this class. We just try and answer whatever people send us. And so if you have questions, send them in, and that's what we'll do next time. Next week, Zach Martin, who was with us a couple weeks ago, Zach will be with us again. And I think we're going to be talking about the doctrine of the perseverance of the saints. You may also hear it called the assurance of salvation, or once saved, always saved. Right? I think the technical name, I think, is the perseverance of the saints. At least that's the more common usage. And so that's what we're going to talk about next time. And just to kind of give you a preview of that, there is assurance for salvation, I believe. But at the same time, while your salvation can be assured, you can know that you are saved, you can also choose to leave. The Israelites, just to kind of give you a preview, the Israelites could know that they were God's covenant people. He redeemed them, he bought them, he became their God, they became his people, but they were also free to leave. And when they left, they were the ones who left God. God did not leave them. All right, so that's kind of just a preview of what we'll be talking about next week. I'm looking forward to having Zach join us. He always does an excellent job explaining things and talking through things. So I love it when I get to study with him. And so that's what we'll be doing next week. God bless you all. I'm glad that we got to see you, and we'll see you soon.